slow and steady. Tonight, the spirit of abundance will visit us. But only those who are pure in faith will be able to receive its blessings. There was a young man named Chijioke, who worked as a mechanic in a small workshop by the roadside, and got ready for customers who would bring their cars, motorcycles, and even broken down generators to him. Chijioke was good at his job, and people liked him for his honesty, but no matter how hard he worked, money was always a problem. One afternoon, as Chijioke wiped sweat off his face after fixing a stubborn generator, a shiny black SUV pulled up outside his workshop. Chijioke, the door opened, and out stepped a man wearing a gold wristwatch, spotless white agbada, and dark sunglasses. "Tunde?" Chijioke asked, blinking in surprise. "Chijioke, my brother," the man said, laughing as he pulled off the sunglasses. It was Tunde, Chijioke's childhood friend. But while Chijioke stayed behind to help his family and work as a mechanic, Tunde had left years ago and hadn't been heard from since. "Tunde, look at you," Chijioke said, wiping his greasy hands on a rag before shaking his friend's hand. "You look like a politician. What are you doing back here?" Tunde chuckled, showing off his white teeth. "Ah, my brother, God has blessed me. I just thought I should check on my old friends. But look at you. You're still working here." Chijioke shrugged. "Work is work, Tunde. Things are not easy, but we thank God." Tunde shook his head and smiled. "Chijioke, you can't keep living like this. There's a better way. In fact, there's a place I need to take you." Chijioke frowned. "What place?" "It's a church," Tunde said, leaning in as if sharing a secret. "Divine Grace International Ministries. Pastor Ezen is the one in charge. My brother, that woman is not ordinary. She has changed my life completely. Do you think all this," he gestured to his car and clothes, "is by luck? No, it's by the grace of God through her." Chijioke hesitated. He wasn't sure about all these flashy churches he kept hearing about. His mother always warned him to be careful with people who promised too much. "I don't know, Tunde," he said. "Churches like that, I don't trust them." "Ah, Chijioke, you're thinking like someone who doesn't want to leave this workshop." Tunde laughed, slapping him on the back. "Just come once. What do you have to lose? You'll thank me later." After much persuasion, Chijioke finally agreed. "Okay, I'll come," he said. "But if I don't like what I see, I'm not going back." "Fair enough," Tunde said, grinning. "You won't regret it." That Sunday, Chijioke put on his best shirt and trousers and followed Tunde to Divine. "Relax," Tunde said, leading him inside. The interior was even more luxurious. The floors were shiny, and chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Ushers dressed in crisp white uniforms greeted them with wide smiles and directed them to their seats. Chijioke noticed that most of the people in the church were well-dressed and looked wealthy. The service began with a choir singing songs that made the air feel electric. The sound system was perfect, and the voices of the singers were so beautiful that Chijioke almost forgot where he was. Then Pastor Ezen appeared. She was a tall, elegant woman with a commanding presence. She wore a sparkling blue gown and had a soft but firm voice that filled the room without needing a microphone. "My brothers and sisters," she began, "I welcome you to Divine Grace International Ministries, where God's blessings overflow like rivers of gold. Are you ready to receive your breakthrough today?" The congregation erupted in shouts of "Amen" and claps. Chijioke couldn't take his eyes off her. She moved with such confidence, and her words seemed to hold a kind of power. Pastor Ezen's sermon was about unlocking heavenly treasures. She told stories of people who came to the church with nothing but left with more wealth than they could imagine. She spoke about the importance of faith and commitment, and how blessings were reserved for those who believed wholeheartedly. At one point, she raised her hands and said, "Someone here is struggling with poverty, but today, your story will change. If you are ready to unlock your blessings, come forward." Dozens of people rushed to the altar, kneeling and crying. Chijioke stayed in his seat, unsure of what to do. Tunde nudged him. "Go now. Don't let this chance pass you by." Chijioke shook his head. "I'm not ready." "Chijioke, this is how it starts," Tunde whispered urgently. You have to show faith. Pastor Ezen will notice you. After the service, Tunde introduced Chijioke to some of the church members. They all spoke about how their lives had changed since joining the church. A businessman said he went from being in debt to owning 3 houses. A young woman claimed she received a scholarship to study abroad after praying with Pastor Ezen. Everything you see here is real, Tunde said as they left. Just keep coming, and you'll see for yourself. Chijioke attended more services over the next few weeks. Each time, he was amazed by how smooth everything seemed. The sermons, the music, the testimonies. But something about it all felt too good to be true. He noticed that the congregation was made up mostly of rich people, and he wondered why they needed a church if they were already doing so well. One Sunday, after the service, an usher approached Chijioke. Pastor Ezen would like to see you in her office, she said with a polite smile. Chijioke's heart pounded as he followed the usher through the grand hallways. Pastor Ezen's office was at the end of a long corridor. The door was opened, and Chijioke stepped inside. The office was as grand as the rest of the church, but something about it made him uneasy. Behind Pastor Ezen's desk was a massive aquarium filled with colorful fish. The water bubbled softly, and the fish swam in lazy circles, their bright eyes catching the light. "Ah, Chijioke," Pastor Ezen said, gesturing for him to sit. "I've heard a lot about you from Brother Tunde. He says you are a hard-working young man with great potential." Chijioke sat nervously. "Thank you, Ma." Pastor Ezen leaned forward, her eyes fixed on him. "I see greatness in you, Chijioke. But to unlock it, you must be ready to take a step of faith. Are you ready?" I think so," Chijioke stammered. "Good," she said, smiling. "I want you to think about joining the inner circle. It's a group of dedicated members who are ready to go deeper in their faith and receive greater blessings. You don't have to decide now, but think about it." Chijioke nodded, though his mind was racing. He thanked her and left the office, but the image of the fish in the aquarium stayed with him. As Tunde drove him home, Chijioke asked, "Tunde, what is this inner circle she talked about?" Tunde smiled. "Ah, my brother, that is where the real blessings come. It's not for everyone, but if Pastor Ezen invited you, it means she sees something special in you. Don't worry, you'll understand when the time comes." Chijioke nodded but felt a knot of unease in his stomach. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had stepped into something far bigger than he could handle. And so, his journey with the Church of Prosperity truly began. When Chijioke got home that night, he couldn't sleep. He lay on his thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Pastor Ezen's words. "I see greatness in you." What did she mean by greatness? And what was this inner circle she mentioned? The next Sunday, Tunde came to pick him up again. This time, as they drove to church, Tunde started talking about the inner circle. "You know," Tunde said, tapping the steering wheel, "the inner circle is not just about money. It's about being part of something bigger, something powerful." "What do you mean?" Chijioke asked, frowning. "It's like," Tunde paused, choosing his words carefully. "It's like being in a family where everyone supports each other. Once you're in, your life changes forever." Chijioke didn't know what to say, so he stayed quiet. After the service, the same usher approached Chijioke again. "Pastor Ezen would like to see you in her office," she said with her usual polite smile. Chijioke's heart started racing as he followed the usher down the same long corridor. The aquarium in Pastor Ezen's office looked even larger this time, and the fish seemed to move more slowly, their eyes gleaming as if they were watching him. "Ah, my dear Chijioke," Pastor Ezen said, gesturing for him to sit. "I'm glad you came back. Have you thought about what we discussed?" Chijioke shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I'm still thinking about it." "Ma, that's good," she said, smiling. "Take your time. But remember, the door to greatness doesn't stay open forever. When you're ready, I want you to come to a special meeting this Friday night. Only a few people are invited, and I believe you belong there." Chijioke hesitated. "What kind of meeting is it?" "It's a time for those who are serious about their faith to come together and connect with the blessings waiting for them," she said. "I know you've been working hard, Chijioke, But hard work alone won't take you far. You need faith. You need power. That Friday night, Chijioke arrived at the church just as the city lights flickered on. The building looked different in the dark, almost like a shadowy castle. He felt a shiver run down his spine but shook it off and walked in. Inside, the atmosphere was quiet and tense. Only a handful of people were there, all dressed in black. Tunde was among them, and he quickly came to Chijioke's side. "Relax," Tunde whispered. "Just follow my lead." Pastor Ezen appeared, her presence filling the room. She wore a simple white gown this time, but it made her look even more powerful. "Welcome, my chosen ones," she said, her voice calm and steady. "Tonight, we take the first step on a journey that will change your lives forever." She led them to a smaller room behind the main auditorium. It was dimly lit, with candles on a table and a strange smell in the air, like a mix of perfume and something sharp. "Before we begin," Pastor Ezen said, "I need you to understand what this means. Joining the inner circle is not just a decision, it's a commitment. Are you ready to give everything? Your time, your energy, your faith, for a life of abundance?" The group murmured their agreement, but Chijioke hesitated. Tunde nudged him. "Say yes," he whispered. "Yes," Chijioke said, though his voice shook. "Good," Pastor Ezen said. "Now, let us seal this commitment." She handed each of them a piece of paper and a pen. "This is a covenant," she explained. "It is a promise between you and God that you will stay loyal to this family. Sign it only if you are ready to leave your old life behind and step into greatness." Chijioke stared at the paper in his hands. It was blank except for the words, "I commit to the path of abundance." His heart pounded as he picked up the pen. "Chijioke," Tunde whispered, "this is it. Don't let fear hold you back." With trembling hands, Chijioke signed the paper. The rest of the night was a blur of candles, chants, and strange rituals. Pastor Ezen poured water into a bowl and asked them to drink from it, saying it was sacred water that would cleanse their spirits. Chijioke hesitated but drank when he saw the others doing it. As the night went on, Chijioke felt a strange heaviness in the air. He couldn't explain it, but something about the whole ceremony made him feel uneasy. When he got home, he collapsed onto his bed, exhausted. That night, he had another dream. He was standing by the ocean, and the water was rising quickly, pulling him in. He tried to run, but his feet were stuck. Then he saw her, Pastor Ezen, but she wasn't human. Her lower body was a shimmering fish tail, and her eyes glowed like fire. "Chijioke," she whispered, her voice echoing in his head. "You belong to me now." He woke up gasping for air, his heart pounding. For a long time, he sat in the dark, wondering what he had gotten himself into. The next day, Tunde called. "How are you feeling, my brother?" he asked cheerfully. "I don't know, Tunde," Chijioke said, his voice shaky. "That meeting last night. It felt strange." "Ah, Chijioke, you're overthinking," Tunde said. "This is how it starts. Just trust the process. You'll see results soon." Chijioke wanted to believe him, but deep down, he felt a growing sense of dread. Something about this path didn't feel right, but it was too late to turn back now. Chijioke was restless for days after the meeting. Something about what had happened that night wouldn't leave his mind. The chants, the strange water, the paper he signed. It all felt wrong, like a bad dream he couldn't wake up from. Every time he tried to forget, the memory of Pastor Ezen's glowing eyes in his dream flashed in his mind. The next Sunday, he went to church again. Tunde picked him up as usual, and on the way, Chijioke decided to speak up. "Tunde," he began slowly, "something has been bothering me." "What is it?" Tunde asked, keeping his eyes on the road. "That meeting we went to. Did it feel strange to you?" Tunde chuckled. "Ah, Chijioke, you're still thinking about that? Relax, my brother. This is how the blessings begin. You're just not used to it yet. But why all the secrecy?" Chijioke pressed. "Why does it feel like we're hiding something?" Tunde's smile faded. He glanced at Chijioke briefly before turning back to the road. "Look, if you want to succeed, You have to stop asking too many questions. Just trust Pastor Ezen. She knows what she's doing. Chijioke didn't respond. He stared out the window, feeling more uneasy than ever. During the service, Pastor Ezen preached about obedience and loyalty. Her voice was calm, but her words carried a weight that made Chijioke's chest tighten. Those who question the path will never reach their destination, she said, her eyes sweeping over the congregation. Doubt is the enemy of blessings. To receive, you must trust completely. Chijioke felt as if she was speaking directly to him. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. After the service, as they were leaving, Chijioke noticed two men whispering near the back of the church. They looked nervous, glancing around as if they didn't want to be seen. When one of them caught Chijioke staring, he quickly turned away and walked off. Who are those people? Chijioke asked Tunde. Just some members, Tunde said dismissively. Why are you always looking for something to worry about? I'm not looking for anything, Chijioke replied. But something doesn't feel right. Tunde sighed. Chijioke, you're going to ruin this for yourself if you keep doubting. Do you think I got where I am by questioning everything? No. I listened. I obeyed. And now look at me. Chijioke stayed quiet, but his unease grew. That week, Pastor Ezen called Chijioke and asked him to come to the church during the day. I have a special task for you, she said. When Chijioke arrived, he was taken to her office again. The aquarium was there, just as large and strange as before. The fish swam slowly, their movements hypnotic. Ah, Chijioke, Pastor Ezen said warmly. Thank you for coming. Yes, Ma, Chijioke said, trying to hide his nervousness. I need someone I can trust to help me with something important, she said, her eyes fixed on him. You've proven yourself to be loyal, and I believe you're ready for more responsibility. What do you need me to do, Mao? I want you to clean this office, she said, gesturing around the room. Pay special attention to the aquarium. The fish are very important to me. Chijioke frowned. Clean the aquarium. Yes, she said firmly. It's a delicate task, but I know you can handle it. Chijioke nodded, though he felt uneasy. As Pastor Ezen left the room, he approached the aquarium cautiously. The fish swam closer to the glass as if they were watching him. Their eyes seemed brighter than before, almost human-like. He picked up the cleaning supplies she had left and began wiping the glass. As he worked, he accidentally nicked his finger on the edge of the tank. A drop of blood fell into the water. Before Chijioke could react, one of the fish darted forward and swallowed the blood. Its eyes glowed for a moment, and it swam away as if nothing had happened. Chijioke stumbled back, his heart racing. That night, he called Tunde. Tunde, I need to talk to you. What is it now? Tunde asked, sounding irritated. There's something wrong with this church, Chijioke said, his voice trembling. Those fish in Pastor Ezen's office, they're not normal. What are you talking about? Tunde asked sharply. I saw one of them swallow blood, Chijioke said. My blood. And its eyes. Tunde, something is not right. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Tunde said, Chijioke, I warned you about asking too many questions. Do you think you can understand everything? Just follow the path and stop trying to figure it all out. But Tunde... No! Tunde interrupted. If you don't trust Pastor Ezen, then maybe this isn't the place for you. Chijioke's stomach sank. He had never heard Tunde sound so angry before. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I just don't understand. You will, eventually, Tunde said, his voice softer now. But for now, just do as you're told. The next Sunday, Chijioke went to church again, though every part of him wanted to stay home. This time, he kept his head down and avoided making eye contact with anyone. During the service, Pastor Ezen called him out. Brother Chijioke, she said, smiling at him from the pulpit. Please stand. Chijioke stood slowly, his heart pounding. This young man is a shining example of faith and obedience, she said. God has great plans for him, and I believe he will achieve greatness very soon. The congregation clapped, but Chijioke felt a chill run down his spine. He sat down quickly, wishing he could disappear. After the service, Tunde approached him. "You see," he said, grinning. "Pastor Ezen sees your potential. Stop doubting and embrace it." Chijioke forced a smile but said nothing. Deep down, he felt like he was being pulled into something he couldn't escape. The next few weeks were a blur. Chijioke continued attending services, but he felt more like a spectator than a participant. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. One evening, as he walked home from the workshop, he overheard two men talking near the market. "Did you hear about Chima?" one of them asked. "What about him?" the other replied. "They say he went missing after joining that big church in the city. Divine something." Chijioke froze. "Ah, I've heard stories about that place," the second man said. "People go there for riches, but not everyone comes back." Chijioke hurried past them, his heart racing. The name Chima stuck in his mind. Hadn't he seen that name on the church's prayer list a few weeks ago? He tried to push the thought away, but it kept coming back. What had he gotten himself into? Chijioke couldn't keep quiet anymore. After hearing about Chima's disappearance, the uneasiness he had been feeling grew stronger. He wanted to confront Tunde, but every time he tried to start the conversation, the words got stuck in his throat. Tunde had been his closest friend, but now he seemed like a stranger, someone who hid secrets that were too dark to uncover. One Wednesday evening, Tunde called him. "Chijioke," Tunde said, his tone serious. "Pastor Ezen has invited us to a special midnight meeting at the church. This one is not like the others. It's very important." Chijioke's stomach tightened. "Midnight? Why at that time?" Tunde laughed softly. "Ah, my brother. You're still asking too many questions. Just trust the process. This is the next step for us." "I don't know, Tunde," Chijioke said, hesitating. "Something about all this feels strange." "Chijioke, listen to me," Tunde said sharply. "You've come this far. Do you want to turn back now? Do you think greatness is easy to achieve? If you miss this meeting, you might never get another chance." Chijioke was silent. "I'll pick you up at 11, Tunde added before ending the call. That night, Chijioke couldn't eat or sleep. The air in his small room felt heavy, and every noise outside made him jump. What was going to happen at this meeting? What was he walking into? At exactly 11, Tunde arrived. Chijioke got into the car without a word. Tunde was unusually quiet as they drove, the hum of the engine filling the silence between them. When they reached the church, it looked different in the darkness. The golden gates that once seemed welcoming now looked like the bars of a cage. The tall glass windows reflected the faint moonlight, giving the building an eerie glow. Inside, the air was cold and still. Only a few people were there, all wearing white robes. Chijioke recognized some faces but not all. He noticed that everyone seemed tense, their eyes darting around as if they were afraid of something. Pastor Ezen appeared, her white gown flowing as she walked. She smiled, but there was something unsettling about it. "Welcome, my chosen ones," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "Tonight, we take the next step in your journey. You have all shown faith and commitment, and now it is time to seal your covenant." Chijioke's heart pounded. He wanted to ask what she meant, but his throat felt dry, and his voice refused to come out. Pastor Ezen led the group into a smaller, darker room behind the main auditorium. Candles lined the walls, casting flickering shadows. In the center of the room was a table covered with a white cloth. On it were strange objects, bowls, a knife, and what looked like a jar of red liquid. Chijioke's knees felt weak, but he forced himself to stay upright. He glanced at Tunde, who gave him a reassuring nod. "Before we proceed," Pastor Ezen said, "I need to remind you that this path is not for everyone. To receive true abundance, you must give something in return. Are you all ready to make this sacrifice?" The group murmured their agreement, but Chijioke remained silent. His mind was spinning. Pastor Ezen's eyes landed on him. "Brother Chijioke, do you have doubts?" All eyes turned to him. He felt like a cornered animal. "No, ma," he stammered. "Good," she said, her smile widening. "Because tonight, We show our faith with action. She gestured for the first person to step forward. It was a young man Chijioke didn't recognize. The man hesitated but eventually walked to the table. Pastor Ezen handed him the knife and whispered something into his ear. The man's hands shook as he took the knife and made a small cut on his palm, letting a few drops of blood fall into one of the bowls. "Your blood is your covenant," Pastor Ezen said. "With this act, you bind yourself to the blessings that await you." One by one, the others followed, each cutting their palms and letting their blood drip into the bowl. When it was Chijioke's turn, his legs felt like they would give out. "Step forward, Brother Chijioke," Pastor Ezen said, her voice steady. Chijioke swallowed hard and stepped to the table. The knife felt cold and heavy in his hand. "Show your faith," Pastor Ezen said softly. Chijioke closed his eyes, his hand trembling as he made a small cut on his palm. The blood dripped into the bowl, and he felt a strange sense of relief, though his heart still pounded. "Good," Pastor Ezen said. "You have all proven your loyalty tonight." After the blood ritual, Pastor Ezen began chanting in a language Chijioke didn't recognize. Her voice grew deeper and more intense with each word, filling the room with an almost unbearable tension. Chijioke felt a strange energy in the air, like static electricity. The candles flickered wildly, and the shadows on the walls seemed to move on their own. As the chanting reached its peak, Pastor Ezen raised her hands, and the jar of red liquid on the table began to glow. The group gasped, and Chijioke felt a cold chill run down his spine. "Tonight, the covenant is sealed," Pastor Ezen said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "You are now part of a family that cannot be broken. Your blessings will flow, but remember, obedience is the key to keeping them." The room fell silent. The group looked at each other, unsure of what had just happened. "Go home now," Pastor Ezen said. "Rest and prepare for the abundance that is coming your way." On the way home, Chijioke couldn't stop thinking about what he had just witnessed. "Tunde," he said finally, breaking the silence. "What was all that?" "That was the covenant," Tunde said simply. "But what does it mean?" Chijioke pressed. "It means we're on the path to greatness," Tunde said, his tone impatient. "Why are you always looking for answers? Just trust the process." Chijioke didn't respond. He stared out the window, wondering if he had made the biggest mistake of his life. That night, Chijioke had another dream. He was standing in the middle of a vast ocean, the water rising around him. He tried to swim, but the waves pulled him under. As he struggled, he saw Pastor Ezen again. Her lower body was a shimmering fish tail, and her eyes glowed like fire. "Chijioke," she said, her voice echoing in his head. "You belong to me now." He woke up gasping for air, his heart racing. For the first time, he realized he might not be able to escape. Chijioke couldn't shake the feeling of dread as he woke up the next morning. The dream had left him shaken, but the events of the midnight meeting haunted him even more. He had seen the way Pastor Ezen controlled the room with her voice and presence. He remembered the glowing jar, the blood covenant, and the fear in the eyes of some of the other members. He tried to go about his day as usual, fixing cars and chatting with customers at his workshop, but his hands trembled every time he picked up a wrench. Ifini, his apprentice, noticed again. "Ogre, are you sure you're okay?" Ifini asked. Chijioke forced a smile. "I'm fine, just tired." But he wasn't fine. The following week, another call came from Pastor Ezen. "Brother Chijioke," she said, her voice as calm as ever. "There is another special gathering this Friday. This one is very important. You must be there." "Yes, Ma," Chijioke said, though his chest tightened. When Friday arrived, Tunde picked him up as usual, and they drove to the church in silence. This time, the atmosphere felt heavier, darker, as if the air itself was warning him to turn back. Inside the church, Pastor Ezen welcomed them with her usual smile. She led the group to the same candlelit room, where the table had been replaced with a large circle drawn on the floor in white chalk. Strange symbols filled the circle, and in the middle was a small wooden box. "This is a night of revelation," Pastor Ezen said, her voice low and steady. "Tonight, the spirit of abundance will visit us. but only those who are pure in faith will be able to receive its blessings. The group exchanged nervous glances. "Let us begin," she said. The group gathered around the circle, and Pastor Ezen began chanting again in that strange, deep voice. The air in the room grew colder, and Chijiok felt the hairs on his arms stand on end. As the chanting continued, Pastor Ezen opened the wooden box. Inside was a small, black stone that seemed to pulse with an inner light. "This stone is a gift from the spirit of abundance," she said. "Each of you will touch it and feel its power. But beware, if your faith is not strong, it will reject you." Chijiok's heart raced. He watched as the first person, a middle-aged man, stepped forward and touched the stone. The man's face lit up, and he smiled as if he had just seen a miracle. The next person, a young woman, hesitated but eventually touched the stone. She gasped, her eyes widening in awe. One by one, the others stepped forward. When it was Chijiok's turn, he froze. "Brother Chijiok," Pastor Ezen said, her eyes boring into him. "Step forward." Chijiok felt like his feet were glued to the floor. He glanced at Tunde, who nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the circle and reached out to touch the stone. The moment his fingers brushed it, he felt a jolt, like a shock of electricity running through his body. His vision blurred, and for a split second, he saw the ocean again, the same ocean from his dreams. He heard Pastor Ezen's voice echoing in his head. "You belong to me now." He pulled his hand back, trembling. "Very good," Pastor Ezen said, smiling. "You are ready." Chijiok didn't feel ready. He felt like he was being dragged deeper into something he couldn't escape. The night continued with another ritual. This time, Pastor Ezen brought out a live chicken and handed it to a young man who looked barely out of his teens. The boy's hands shook as he held the bird, his eyes wide with fear. "This is your test of faith," Pastor Ezen said. "Take the knife and make the offering." The boy hesitated, his eyes darting between the knife and Pastor Ezen. I can't," he stammered. "You must," she said, her voice firm. "The spirit of abundance demands it." The boy shook his head. "I can't do it. Please, Ma, I'm not ready." Pastor Ezen's smile vanished. She took a step closer to him, her eyes glowing faintly in the candlelight. "Do you think blessings come without sacrifice?" she said, her voice cold. "If you are not ready to give, you are not ready to receive." The boy dropped the chicken and backed away, his hands raised in surrender. "I'm sorry. I can't." Pastor Ezen sighed and gestured to two of the white-robed men standing nearby. "Take him away." The men grabbed the boy by the arms and dragged him out of the room. His cries echoed down the hallway, sending a chill through Chijiok's body. The ritual continued as if nothing had happened. Pastor Ezen performed the offering herself, her hands steady as she made the cut. The room filled with the metallic smell of blood, and Chijiok felt his stomach turn. By the time the ritual ended, Chijiok was ready to collapse. His legs felt weak, and his mind was spinning. As the group dispersed, Pastor Ezen called out to him. "Brother Chijiok, stay behind for a moment." Chijiok's heart sank, but he obeyed. When the others had left, Pastor Ezen approached him. Her smile was warm, but her eyes held something darker. "You did well tonight," she said, "but I sense that you still have doubts." I don't know, Ma," Chijiok stammered. "This is all so new to me." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "Doubt is natural, my son, but you must overcome it. The blessings you seek are within your reach, but only if you fully commit." Chijiok nodded, though he didn't trust himself to speak. "Go home and rest," she said. "Pray for clarity. The spirit of abundance will guide you." On the drive home, Chijiok couldn't stop replaying the events of the night in his mind. The glowing stone, the boy's cries, the blood, all of it felt like a nightmare. "Tunde," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "What happened to that boy?" Tunde didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his tone was flat. "He wasn't ready. That's all." "What do you mean, not ready?" Chijiok pressed. "What happens to people who aren't ready?" Tunde sighed. "Chijiok, stop asking questions. Focus on yourself. You're doing well. Don't let fear distract you. Chijioke leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was in over his head. That night, he had another dream. This time, he was standing in the middle of the church, but it was completely submerged underwater. The pews floated around him, and the candles flickered dimly in the murky depths. In the distance, he saw Pastor Ezen. She was no longer wearing her white gown. Her lower body was a massive fish tail, shimmering in the dark water. Her glowing eyes locked onto his, and she smiled. Chijioke, she said, her voice echoing in the water. There is no turning back now. He woke up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. For the first time, he realized that he might not survive this journey. Chijioke could feel the walls closing in. After everything he'd witnessed, the strange rituals, the glowing stone, the boy being dragged away, he knew there was no going back to the life he once had. Yet the thought of moving forward with Pastor Ezen's church filled him with dread. 4 days, he went through the motions at his workshop, barely able to focus on his work. Ifini, his apprentice, noticed the change. "Ogre, you've been quiet these days," Ifini said one afternoon as they worked on a car. "I'm fine, Ifini," Chijioke replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "You sure? You haven't even shouted at me for anything," the boy said with a small grin, trying to lighten the mood. Chijioke forced a chuckle, but the truth was he felt far from fine. He couldn't shake the images from the last meeting. The chalk circle, the blood dripping into the bowl, the boy's cries. And then there was the dream, that terrible dream of Pastor Ezen standing in the ocean, her tail shimmering as she claimed him as hers. He hadn't been able to sleep since. One evening, Tunde called. Chijioke hesitated before answering, his thumb hovering over the green button on his phone. He didn't want to talk to Tunde, but he knew ignoring him would only make things worse. "Chijioke," Tunde said when the call connected. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "How are you?" "I'm fine," Chijioke lied. "You don't sound fine," Tunde said. "You've been distant lately. Are you having doubts?" Chijioke's heart skipped a beat. "No, it's not that. I've just been busy with work." Tunde said, and there was a long pause. Then he added, "Pastor Ezen wants to see you. She said it's urgent." Chijioke's stomach sank. "Why?" "She didn't say," Tunde replied. "But you should go. You know she doesn't like to be kept waiting." Chijioke arrived at the church the next day, his palms slick with sweat. Pastor Ezen's office felt colder than usual, and the fish in the aquarium seemed to be watching him as he walked in. "Brother Chijioke," Pastor Ezen said, smiling warmly. "I'm glad you came." "Yes, Ma," Chijioke said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the chair in front of her desk. Chijioke sat down, his heart pounding. "You've been quiet lately," she began. "Tunde says you've been distracted. Is everything all right?" "I'm fine, Ma," Chijioke said quickly. "Are you sure?" she asked, leaning forward slightly. "Because doubt is dangerous, Chijioke. It weakens the spirit and blocks the flow of blessings." "I understand, Ma," he said, though he didn't feel like he did. Pastor Ezen studied him for a moment, her eyes sharp and piercing. Then she smiled. "Good," she said, "because you've come far, and I believe you are ready for the next step." Chijioke's stomach churned. "The next step?" "Yes," she said, her tone serious. "You've shown faith and commitment, but now it's time to prove your loyalty. The spirit of abundance requires a blood price." Chijioke felt like the air had been knocked out of him. "A blood price?" he repeated. "Yes," she said, nodding. "True blessings come at a cost, Chijioke. To receive, you must give. And what the spirit requires is blood. Someone close to you, someone you care about. Their sacrifice will seal your covenant and unlock the abundance you seek." Chijioke stared at her, unable to speak. His mind raced, searching for a way out, but her eyes held him in place like a predator watching its prey. I don't think I can do that," he finally managed to say, his voice trembling. Pastor Ezen's smile faded. She leaned back in her chair, her expression calm but cold. "Then perhaps you are not ready for greatness," she said. "But be warned, Chijioke. Breaking a covenant has consequences. The spirit does not take kindly to those who turn away." Chijioke stumbled out of the office, his mind spinning. He barely noticed the other church members as he made his way out of the building. By the time he got home, his hands were shaking so badly that he could barely unlock the door. That night, he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Pastor Ezen's face, her calm smile as she spoke of blood and sacrifice. The next morning, he decided he couldn't face this alone. He went to visit Maman Kechi, his aunt, who had always been a source of comfort and wisdom. "Maman Kechi, I need your help," he said as he sat down in her small living room. She looked at him closely, her brow furrowed. "What's wrong, my son?" Chijioke hesitated, then began to tell her everything. The rituals, the dreams, the blood price. By the time he finished, his hands were shaking, and tears threatened to spill from his eyes. Maman Kechi listened silently, her face growing more serious with every word. When he was done, she sighed deeply and shook her head. "My son," she said, "you are in grave danger. This is not of God. This is the work of dark spirits." "I know, Maman Kechi," Chijioke said, his voice breaking. "But what do I do? I feel trapped. If I refuse, they'll come after me." Maman Kechi reached for his hands and held them tightly. "You must pray, Chijioke. You must ask God for deliverance. These people cannot hold you if you put your trust in him. But what if it's too late?" Chijioke asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's never too late, my son," she said firmly. "But you must be strong. The road ahead will not be easy." That night, Chijioke tried to pray, but his mind was clouded with fear. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Pastor Ezen's glowing eyes, heard her voice echoing in his head. The spirit does not take kindly to those who turn away. The next day, Tunde showed up at his workshop unannounced. "Chijioke," Tunde said, his tone unusually serious. "We need to talk." "What is it?" Chijioke asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Pastor Ezen told me what happened," Tunde said. "She's disappointed in you." Chijioke felt a lump in his throat. "I didn't say I wouldn't do it. I just need time." "Time for what?" Tunde snapped. "Do you think you have forever? The spirit is patient, but only to a point. If you delay too long, you'll lose everything." Chijioke's hands tightened into fists. "What am I supposed to do? Tunde? Sacrifice someone I care about? How can you expect me to do that?" Tunde's expression softened slightly. "I know it's hard," he said, "but I've been where you are, Chijioke. I had doubts too. But once I made my sacrifice, everything changed. My life became better than I ever imagined." Chijioke stared at him, horrified. You did it." "Yes," Tunde said, his voice quiet. "I sacrificed my younger brother. It wasn't easy, but I knew it was the only way." Chijioke felt like he was going to be sick. He turned away, unable to look at Tunde. That night, Chijioke had another dream. He was standing at the edge of a cliff, the ocean roaring below him. Pastor Ezen was there, her fishtail shimmering in the moonlight. "Jump," she said, her voice echoing. "Prove your loyalty." "I can't," Chijioke said, stepping back. "Then you are mine," she said, her eyes glowing brighter. Chijioke woke up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. For the first time, he realized that the battle for his soul had truly begun. The days after Tunde's confession passed in a haze for Chijioke. He barely ate, barely slept, and barely worked. Every time he tried to focus on something else, his mind dragged him back to Pastor Ezen's office, to her calm words about the blood price. Tunde's voice haunted him. "Too, I sacrificed my younger brother. It wasn't easy, but I knew it was the only way." The thought of doing something like that turned Chijioke's stomach. Yet, as much as he wanted to walk away, he didn't know how. Every time he imagined leaving, he heard Pastor Ezen's warning. Breaking a covenant has consequences. That evening, Chijioke went back to Maman Kechi's house. He needed to hear her voice again, needed her to tell him that there was still a way out. As soon as she opened the door, she could see the fear written all over his face. Chijioke, what is it? She asked, pulling him inside. Mama Nkechi, Chijioke said, his voice trembling. I don't know what to do. They're asking me to make a sacrifice, a blood sacrifice. They said if I don't, I'll lose everything, maybe even my life. I'm scared. Mama. I'm really scared. Mama Nkechi grabbed his hands and squeezed them tightly. My son, listen to me, she said. These people don't have power over you unless you give it to them. You have already made mistakes, but God is greater than any spirit or covenant. You can break free, but you must fight. How? Mama Nkechi? Chijioke asked, tears streaming down his face. How do I fight something like this? Through prayer, through faith, she said. But you must also be prepared. These people will not let you go easily. You must be strong, Chijioke. Stronger than you have ever been. Chijioke nodded, though his heart still felt heavy. Mama Nkechi, he said after a long pause, what if they come for me? She looked at him with fierce determination. Then we will face them together. The next morning, Chijioke woke up with a new sense of purpose. He didn't know if he had the strength to fight, but he knew he couldn't keep living like this. He spent the day working at his workshop, trying to block out the dark thoughts in his mind. As the sun began to set, Tunde appeared. Chijioke, Tunde said, his voice urgent. We need to talk. I have nothing to say to you. Tunde, Chijioke replied, wiping his hands on a rag. Don't be foolish, Tunde snapped. Do you think you can run from this? Do you think Pastor Ezen doesn't know what's in your heart? She knows, Chijioke. She knows everything. Chijioke felt a chill run down his spine. What do you want from me, Tunde? I want you to stop fighting, Tunde said. This is your chance, Chijioke. Don't throw it away. You think you can leave, but you can't. Nobody leaves the church. What if I don't want their blessings? Chijioke said, his voice rising. What if I just want my life back? Tunde shook his head. It's too late for that. You made a covenant, Chijioke. You belong to the church now. Chijioke's hands clenched into fists. I don't belong to anyone, he said. Tunde sighed and gave him a long, pitying look. You'll regret this, he said. Then he turned and walked away. That night, Chijioke didn't sleep. He stayed up praying, repeating the words Mama Nkechi had taught him. The room felt heavy, as if unseen eyes were watching him. Every sound outside made him jump, but he kept praying. Around midnight, he heard a knock at his door. Who is it? He called out, his voice shaking. No answer. The knock came again, louder this time. Chijioke grabbed a wooden stick from the corner of the room and approached the door cautiously. Who's there? He demanded. Still no answer. Summoning his courage, he threw the door open and found no one there. The street was empty, the night silent except for the chirping of crickets. Chijioke stepped outside, looking around nervously. That's when he saw it. A shadowy figure standing at the end of the street, watching him. Who are you? Chijioke shouted, his voice echoing in the stillness. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, staring. Chijioke backed into his house and slammed the door shut. His hands were trembling as he reached for his phone and dialed Mama Nkechi's number. Mama Nkechi, he said as soon as she picked up. Something is outside my house. I don't know what it is. Stay calm, my son, she said. Keep praying. I will come to you. When Mama Nkechi arrived, the shadowy figure was gone, but the fear in Chijioke's heart hadn't subsided. They are watching me, he said as she stepped inside. I can feel it. Then we will pray, Mama Nkechi said firmly. The two of them knelt in the middle of the room and began to pray. Mama Nkechi's voice was strong and unwavering, but Chijioke's prayers were filled with desperation. As they prayed, the room grew colder, and the air seemed to vibrate with an unseen energy. The candles on the table flickered wildly, and Chijioke felt a crushing weight pressing down on him. Don't stop, Chijioke. Mama Nkechi shouted. Keep praying. I can't. Chijioke gasped. It's too much. You can do this, Maman Kechi said, grabbing his hand. God is with you. You are stronger than this. Chijioke squeezed his eyes shut and forced himself to keep praying. Slowly, the weight began to lift, and the room grew warmer. The candles steadied, and the oppressive energy began to fade. When it was over, Chijioke collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. The next day, Chijioke knew he couldn't stay in the shadows anymore. He needed to leave the church, no matter what it cost him. He went to Pastor Ezen's office, his heart pounding. She was sitting behind her desk, as calm and composed as ever. Brother Chijioke, she said, smiling. What brings you here? I want out, Chijioke said, his voice trembling but firm. Pastor Ezen's smile faded. Out, she repeated, her voice cold. Yes, Chijioke said. I don't want this anymore. I want my life back. Pastor Ezen leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing. Do you think it's that simple? She asked. You made a covenant, Chijioke. You belong to us now. I don't belong to anyone, Chijioke said, his voice rising. I'm leaving, and there's nothing you can do to stop me. Pastor Ezen's eyes glowed faintly, and the air in the room grew colder. You underestimate the power of the spirit, she said. If you walk away, you will lose everything. Your workshop, your health, your life. Is that what you want? I'll take my chances, Chijioke said, though his hands were trembling. Pastor Ezen stood slowly, her presence filling the room. Then you leave me no choice, she said. Chijioke left the church that day, but his troubles were far from over. Strange things began happening almost immediately. His workshop caught fire, destroying everything he had worked so hard to build. He fell ill, his body racked with pain that no doctor could explain. Through it all, Maman Kechi stayed by his side, praying and encouraging him not to give up. You are stronger than this, Chijioke, she said. Keep fighting. They can take everything from you, but they cannot take your soul. One night, as Chijioke lay in bed, weak and feverish, he had a dream. He was standing in the middle of the ocean, the water rising around him. Pastor Ezen was there, her fishtail shimmering in the moonlight. Come back, she said, her voice soft and seductive. It's not too late. You can still have everything you've ever wanted. No, Chijioke said, his voice shaking but firm. You don't own me. Pastor Ezen's smile faded, and her eyes glowed with anger. Then you will suffer, she said, her voice echoing like thunder. The ocean rose higher, pulling Chijioke under, but he didn't stop fighting. He kicked and struggled, refusing to give in. When he woke up, the fever had broken. The pain in his body was gone, replaced by a quiet strength. For the first time, Chijioke felt truly free. The battle wasn't over, but he knew he had won the first fight. As Chijioke stepped outside into the morning sun, he felt the weight of his choices pressing on him. He had lost everything, his workshop, his peace, but he had gained something far greater, his freedom. Yet deep in his heart, he knew Pastor Ezen wasn't finished with him. The waters were still waiting.